Worldwide condemnations of the Iranian government for its harshest crackdown on opposition protests since the disputed presidential elections last June. Is the opposition taking advantage of religious events to show force? Are these protests affecting the stability of the government? And how deep is the rift among the Iranians? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Huda Abdelhamid. Supporters of Iran's government took to the streets demanding maximum punishment for anti-government protesters. A day earlier, more anti-government demonstrations took place across Iran on the day of Ashura, one of the holiest religious commemoration for Shia Muslims. It all started with the re-election of President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad last June. The result was disputed by the three defeated candidates and millions of Iranians. But just as the post-election crisis seemed to fade away, Grand Ayatollah Hossein Ali Montazeri, an influential opposition cleric, died 10 days ago. Mourners quickly turned his funeral into political rallies in several cities across the country. Since his death, the opposition seems to have gained a new momentum, but confrontations between protesters and the government are becoming more violent. 10 people have been killed over the past 2 days. Nicole Johnson has more on the story.
Protest and counter-protest. 2 days after Iran's opposition held massive demonstrations in Tehran, it was the government's turn. A rally in the capital in support of President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and condemning the opposition's demonstration held on Sunday during Ashura, an important religious event for Shia Muslims. In Esfahan, 2 Iranians demonstrated, and the government says its heavy-handed crackdown on Sunday's protest is justified.
The Islamic Parliament demands government security officials arrest these Ashura protesters who insult religion, and we should consider the harshest sentence without any forgiveness against these people who are opposed to the Islamic Revolution.
State-sponsored television reports 8 people were killed, including Ali Mousavi, the nephew of opposition leader Mir Hossein Mousavi. Iranian officials say they are holding his body and another 4 protesters who were killed. Meanwhile, hundreds of people have been arrested, including high-profile figures like the former Foreign Minister Ibrahim Yazdi and a number of senior advisors to Mousavi and aides to former pro-reformist President Mohammad Khatami. Still, the opposition, both in and outside Iran, say their movement is gaining momentum.
People resistance in Iran is getting stronger against this barbaric regime. It is not only Ahmadinejad who is targeted anymore. It is directly the supreme guide, the number 1 of the mullah's regime.
Protests by both opposition and government supporters are not only a domestic problem for Iran, but an international one as well. As support for the plight of arrested dissidents grows, so too does the pressure inside the Islamic Republic. Nicole Johnston for Inside Story.
Well, joining us today on the show, we have from Washington, D.C., Trita Parsi, the president of the National Iranian-American Council. And from New York, we're joined by Gary Sick, professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University. And on the phone line from Tehran, Kian Mokhtari, a columnist and political commentator. Mr. Trita Parsi, let me start with you. Was it wise of the opposition to turn such a religious festivity like Ashura into a political rally?
Well, I have to say I find the question somewhat odd. The Islamic Republic's own trademark is mixing religion and politics. So for the Islamic Republic to question that religious holidays are used to make political statements is a tremendous oddity and a contradiction in and of itself.
So let me put the same question to Mr. Kian Mokhtari. Was it also wise by the government to have such a harsh crackdown on the demonstrators during Ashura? 10 people are dead and some are already calling them martyrs.
Well, the government actually did not come down harshly on the demonstrators at all, because it was Ashura. No firearms were issued. The Iranian anti-riot police never does carry firearms, and Iran is investigating the issue as we speak.
Okay, so Gary Sick, it seems that there is a hardening of position on both sides. Have we entered a new stage now where really there will be no way to find a compromise between both sides?
Well, on the surface, it looks that way. The protests actually began right after the election, when people marched in the streets and said, you know, give us back our votes. What has happened over Ashura, and particularly since the death of Ayatollah Montazeri, is that the language has changed. It's now death to the dictator and even death to Khamenei directly. So I would say things have hardened. I would not be entirely surprised, however, after a really harsh crackdown, that there might be some private talks behind the scenes, people actually looking for a compromise. It's not clear that that can happen, but it would be a very logical thing for a number of people to do, because the way it's going now, it's just escalating higher and higher, and the government is not winning this battle.
Well, talking about talks behind closed doors, Trita Parsi, there are some rumors today that some negotiations are already being held between the opposition and the government.
Well, as Gary pointed out, it wouldn't be surprising, because now 6 months after the elections, the contested elections, this is continuing, and what it's done is that it's deprived the Ahmadinejad government of any sense of normalcy. If this continues further, the cost is going to be tremendous for the Iranian government, for the system as a whole. So at some point, a compromise needs to be found if the regime is interested in surviving. Now, whether that compromise will be sufficient for the streets, the people on the streets who are protesting, to feel satisfied, is a completely different question.
Well, Gary Sick, Trita Parsi just said if the regime wants to survive, but the regime doesn't seem to be really in any danger now of collapsing, is it?
Well, the regime actually is shrinking. Basically, it used to be that the regime had support from a very large majority of the people, and it had real legitimacy. I think what's happened is that since the election, Mr. Khamenei has actually taken a position on behalf of one party, a narrow group, pro-Ahmadinejad, and that group around him has actually been shrinking in size. Many of the senior clerics are no longer supporting the regime, certainly not openly. More and more people are prepared to go out and march against the regime. And even the professional military seems to be having doubts about things, although the Revolutionary Guard, of course, is the backbone of the regime. But basically, the regime now, the government, is relying increasingly on just naked force, nothing else. And it cannot rely on the support of the people. And as you know, a government that has no support of the people at all and is faced with an insurrection actually is in very serious trouble. And they seem to have lots of force, but they don't seem to have any new ideas.
Now, those who are pro-government, Trita Parsi, say that Mir Hossein Mousavi has lost some support. Certainly, from the outside, it looks that there is no real rallying figure in the opposition. Isn't that putting the opposition a bit on fragile ground?
Many people have pointed out that at times it's not really been clear if this movement is driven by leadership at the top, and if it isn't driven by leadership at the top, what sustainability does it have? But I think 6 months into this, we're seeing that to a certain extent this is a self-organized movement. And it is still using the symbolism of the leadership at the top from Mousavi, etc., but it may not be driven by them. The bottom line is, though, it's still there, it's still growing, it's still depriving the regime of any sense of normalcy. So whether there is a strong leadership at the top or not seems to be less relevant to the fact that it's actually still growing strong.
Now, when these protests started last June, it was people had gone down to the streets to protest the election results. Today, their demand seems to have changed, but it's really not very clear what they're looking after. Trita Parsi.
Yes, no, you're quite right that, from the beginning, as Gary also pointed out, this was a movement that had some very moderate demands, making sure that the votes were counted. But as the brutality of the regime has increased, where it has been very uncompromising, we've seen the tortures in the jails, we've seen the show trials, I don't think it's very surprising that the protesters are demanding more instead of being intimidated. And that's the big mistake, I think, that has been occurred from the perspective of the government itself, that they have, through their brutality, radicalized a movement that at the very beginning was just asking for their votes to be counted.
Well, Gary Sick, now when we look at the pictures of the anti-government protesters and today's pictures of the government protesters, it seems that really the country is split in two.
Yes, I think that is a fair statement. In the past, the government has had a hard time coming up with enough. When you look at the stadiums now, for instance, when Mr. Ahmadinejad goes out into the provinces and gives speeches, in the past, the stadiums would be absolutely packed with people and they would be cheering him. Today, when he goes, the seats are half empty and they have to narrow their camera focus down to make it look as if there are lots of people there. When the government tries to mount a demonstration, a counter-demonstration, yes, they have a group of people marching in the street, but actually, when the opposition does it, they're everywhere. They're in every city in Iran. They are in many, many different places. One point that I could add to what Trita said, and which I agree with very much, when you look at this, this opposition force, I think the key thing about it is that it's very much an internet movement. This, I think, may be the first postmodern revolt that we've ever seen, where you have people, instead of having a single leader with issuing commands and everybody following those, instead you have what looks like more like the internet, with people all in different places in constant communication with each other by Facebook and Twitter and various other means. And that, in some respects, that together with the cell phone cameras, are actually providing the coverage that we actually have of what's going on there. And the decisions seem to emerge almost spontaneously from a very large group of people rather than from a tiny little group that is making decisions. So this is something that I think we've never seen before, and we have no experience with it. And I think we're not in very good shape to try to figure out whether that's going to work or what it will turn into. I assume that some kind of leadership will emerge from the opposition over time, but that, at the moment, it seems to be a vast body of individuals all connected together by the internet.
So, Trita Parsi, the opposition is also under pressure to find some sort of leadership and some sort of organizations, because, I mean, if these spontaneous reactions keep on popping up around the country, it could quickly be just accused of causing chaos in the country, couldn't it?
Well, there is a common sense of direction without necessarily having a strong leadership dictating where to go. And I think as Gary pointed out, it's very difficult to predict exactly how a movement like this will work. But if they succeed and there is significant changes taking place in Iran's political landscape, at that point it will be very, very interesting to see if a movement that is self-organized is also capable not just of being able to challenge a government, but also being able to replace a government with an alternative.
Well, this all happens while Iran is under international pressure. The bloody crackdown by Iranian authorities on the protesters has provoked calls for restraint and strong criticism from the West. U.S. President Barack Obama was among the first leaders to denounce the Iranian government.
Along with all free nations, the United States stands with those who seek their universal rights. We call upon the Iranian government to abide by the international obligations that it has to respect the rights of its own people. We call for the immediate release of all who have been unjustly detained within Iran.
British Foreign Secretary David Miliband also called on Iran to respect the rights of its citizens. The European Union echoed the same demand. And German Chancellor Angela Merkel said the right to free expression through peaceful demonstrations must not be suppressed by violence. Russia, which has strong ties with Tehran, suggested the Iranian government should show restraint and seek compromises on the basic of law. Now, Trita Parsi, all this support, really, international support to the opposition can actually backfire on the opposition, couldn't it?
Well, it depends on how it's characterized and how it's being presented. At the end of the day, if we take a look at what President Obama has been saying, not only yesterday but throughout this period, the principles that the President of the United States is showing support for is the principle of universal rights. He's not interfering in the internal politics of Iran, but rather saying that the United States stands for human rights and is condemning human rights violations, as it should wherever they take place. So that's a different approach than actually going out and saying that the United States is siding with the Green Movement or anything of that nature. That would not be helpful to the Green Movement. It could backfire on them. But for the United States to just express support for human rights and condemn human rights violations is a different thing.
Yes, but in a context, Gary Sick, that where usually the rhetoric coming out of the United States is very condemning towards all Iranians, now to have some sort of rhetoric that shows support to those who are seeking their rights could easily be used by the government, by the sort of the opposition to the opposition, if I may say that, to pinpoint the finger at them.
Well, I agree very much with Trita that what the president is saying is actually not exceptional at all. I know that the Iranians will try, the regime will try to use those words and use those criticisms to show that, in fact, all of this is being plotted by foreigners. The British ambassador, I understand, is being called in today by the Iranians to complain about the British position. But I think they're not going to succeed in that. I don't think anybody in the world believes that somehow all of those people are coming out on the streets and confronting riot police because they've been paid or somehow put to it by the Americans or the British. The reality is that Iran has signed a number of international treaties which actually require it to respect public assembly, to respect freedom of speech, to give people the chance to express their views. They are legally required to do that by their own hand, not by anybody forcing them to do it. And all the international community is saying is, obey your own laws. Do what is fact you have agreed to personally. And I think the regime is not going to find that something very useful to use against the opposition. They will try, but I don't think it will be successful.
Well, Trita Parsi, there seem to be now two clocks ticking in Iran, the domestic clock and the nuclear or international clock. Which one do you think is ticking quicker?
Well, I think it's a very important question, because from the U.S. perspective, for quite some time, the United States has put the nuclear clock at the center and essentially expected all other clocks to adjust to that. But I think we've seen that the domestic clock is far more dynamic and in this situation far more important. For the U.S. to go forward, it's probably better to put the domestic clock at the center and then adjust the nuclear strategy and other security strategies in accordance with that clock. Because otherwise it may end up negotiating with a government that may not exist in a couple of months, or at a minimum is incapable of making decisions of the magnitude necessary to find a solution to the nuclear deal. And as a result, you will see the type of negotiation that we saw this past fall that actually didn't lead anywhere, mainly due to Iran's inability to make decisions as a result of the internal infighting and amongst the Iranian elite.
Well, Gary Sick, is it maybe that Washington now may take the back seat for a little while, just trying to figure out what is happening inside Iran?
That would be a very intelligent thing for Washington to do. Whether Washington will be able to do that is another matter. Washington is under a lot of pressure domestically and from actually a number of its allies to take a very tough line with Iran right now. There are people actually at this moment in the United States openly calling for the United States to bomb Iran, and on the grounds that it's developing nuclear capabilities. I can't imagine anything more foolish or more counterproductive than actually the United States instituting some kind of attack against Iran while all of this is going on domestically. Iran has actually offered now to conduct, the negotiations were about nuclear material, the low enriched uranium that Iran has produced. Iran has now agreed that it would move that material to Turkey and have it being held there while fuel rods were being prepared to insert into the research reactor that Iran has. That's a perfectly reasonable offer. And I think that it would be a mistake for the West to somehow say these negotiations are all over. Why not take the Iranian government at its word? Let them provide that nuclear material and put it into Turkey under the control of the IAEA, and then go ahead with negotiations which actually reduces the threat from Iran's nuclear capability. So there are things that are still possible for the West to do if they have the will to do it. Unfortunately, many people have already decided that the negotiations didn't work, that it's all over, and the only thing you can do now is move to very severe sanctions and possibly war. And I think nothing could be more mistaken at this stage of the game.
So, Trita Parsi, in view of what Gary Sick just said now, is it possible maybe that Tehran will actually soften its line with the international community while dealing with its domestic issues?
It certainly is a possibility, but more than anything else, I think what you will see is that Iran will be increasingly having difficulties sticking to a strategy and making smart decisions. It is very, very difficult for any country to be able to conduct negotiations of this importance, of this relevance, at a time when there is so much internal turmoil. Make the comparison to the United States and Russia negotiating an arms reduction deal in the midst of the crisis when it wasn't decided whether George Bush or Al Gore had won the elections in 2000. It's a very, very difficult time for them to negotiate.
And briefly, Gary Sick, what are we to expect in the weeks and months ahead now?
I don't think anybody knows, and I don't think the regime in Tehran knows, I don't think we know, and I don't think the people on the streets demonstrating know. I do think that there are going to be more demonstrations, that they're going to use all of these different occasions that keep coming up, and there are a number of them coming up in the near future. They will use those for more demonstrations, but what those will produce, if anything, we really do not know. But I think it's a mistake to draw any conclusions at this point, because it could change right in front of our eyes.
And Trita Parsi, the last word for you. The Revolutionary Guard today said that unrest planners will soon pay the price of their insolence. That suggests more arrests and detentions. Now, do you think that that will be effective in stopping the demonstrators from going down to the streets?
Well, it certainly hasn't been effective so far. I think the Iranian government seems to be running out of ideas. They've tried intimidation, they've tried killings and torture and short trials. It hasn't led anywhere. And the latest measure seems to be actually targeting younger family members of major opposition figures. We've seen how they have targeted the sister of Shirin Ebadi, the Nobel Peace Prize winner. The nephew of Mousavi was killed. There are other younger relatives of prominent opposition figures that were arrested last night. I don't think it will work. I think it will only enrage the opposition further and further increase their demands rather than intimidating them.
Well, we did lose communication with Tehran on the show, but still I would like to thank our guests, Trita Parsi and Gary Sick, and thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.